Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How prevalent is sexual violence in conflict zones? What is one UN agency, among several probably, doing to help reduce the conflict? My guest today is an expert on this particular issue. My guest today is Ms. Pramila Patten. Ms. Pramila Patten of Mauritius is the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Ms. Patten, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you and good afternoon.
I appreciate you being with me today. Thank you so much. Sexual violence in conflict. We see there are many areas around the world, and we're going to get into that in a few moments and talk about it. But what is your office? What's the main mission of your office? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, thank you for this question. My office is relatively new. It was established in 2009 through a resolution of the Security Council, Resolution 1888, adopted on the 30th of September 2009, as a result of a realization that despite condemnation of this crime, and the call to all parties to conflict to cease this practice of sexual violence against women and children, but also men, that in many parts of the world, sexual violence was becoming more widespread and in many cases systematic. There was also a concern expressed by the Security Council that perpetrators of this crime was rarely being punished. So through Resolution 1888, the Security Council called on the Secretary General to appoint a special representative to provide strategic and coherent leadership on this question, to be the spokesperson of the United Nations on this question, to engage with governments, including its judicial and security sector representatives, to engage with all parties to conflict. That includes state and non-state actors, state and non-state armed groups, but also to engage with a range of stakeholders, including the United Nations system, through UN action against sexual violence in conflict, which comprise of 14 UN entities, ensuring that there is more coordination, that there is more cooperation amongst the UN entities, and to get the United Nations system to deliver as one, but also to engage with a broader range of stakeholders such as civil society amongst others. The Office of the Special Representative was created in 2010 with Margot Wallström from Sweden as the first special representative appointed. In 2012, the second special representative, Mrs. Zainab Bangura, from Sierra Leone, she was appointed, and I was appointed last year, and I took office in June 2017.
Mm-hmm. And both of the ladies you mentioned have been on our program before, so that's very good. And our viewers can go to your website, www.un.org, Sexual Violence in Conflict, to get more information about what we're going to be talking about today, and some of the things we won't get to in all probability. Let's look at the world. The world's large place, 7.4 billion people right now. Do we have an idea of how many areas, conflict zones, where there's sexual violence? I would guess probably wherever there's violence, there's some type of sexual conflict, or in conflict zones, there's sexual activities taking place, or illicit illegal activities. Is that correct? And do we have an idea of how many there are around the world today, just roughly?
Well, my office covers 19 priority countries. Mm-hmm. If you look at the report of 2017, the report covered 19 countries of concern. These are the priority countries with whose government I engage. And I have like 6-7 situations of concern, such as Sri Lanka, Guatemala, where I'm like keeping watch over these countries. What is also important to understand is that I have a Security Council mandate. It's a fairly narrow, because conflict-related sexual violence, for me to engage with a government, that country must be in armed conflict. So there are issues around definition of armed conflict. Then the conflict nexus must be established. I also only cover sexual violence being perpetrated by state or non-state armed groups, so that I do not cover sexual violence being perpetrated by civilians, for example. Since I took office last year, I have been on a number of field missions. I think it's very important to go and engage with the government, but also to meet with survivors. So, for example, since last June, I have been to the Democratic Republic of Congo. I have been to Nigeria, where I met with the Chibok girls in Abuja, but I also met with the others who have been released from the captivity of Boko Haram. I have been in Sudan, Darfur, in South Sudan. I've been in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I've been to Myanmar. I've been to Cox's Bazar to meet with the Rohingya refugees. And in fact, it's my exchange, my meeting with the survivors that really drive my strategies for the mandate and my interventions, because I have to meet with survivors to understand their experiences and their needs.
We're going to be talking about some of the places you've visited. And when you were going through that list, I was thinking those are very, very volatile areas. Those are extremely dangerous areas, and there is a lot of violence taking place in those particular areas. So obviously there's a great need for your services. I know on your website you have 3 areas of priorities. What are those 3 areas of priorities?
Right. When I took office last year, I set my own strategic priorities for the mandate, because over the past 8-9 years, it's true that the mandate has done a great job in terms of the advocacy around this subject. Today, sexual violence in conflict is very high on the international agenda. So I had to move beyond the advocacy work. And for me, it's critical that we reverse the culture of impunity into a culture of prevention and deterrence through justice and accountability. That's one. Secondly, sexual violence does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in times of peace, and it gets exacerbated in times of conflict and post-conflict. So it's critical that we address the root cause of the sexual violence, with gender inequality, discrimination, poverty, and marginalization being the invisible driver of this sexual violence. Thirdly, for me, the face of the mandate is that of a survivor. I think it was a mandate that was established for the victims, for the survivors. And it is therefore critical that I have a survivor-centered approach, a very holistic survivor-centered approach. So these are the 3 strategic priorities that I have set. And how do I achieve these priorities? Firstly, like the implementing arm of my office, I have a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence located in my office, comprising of experts from the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, from UNDP. This pool of experts, they are supported by a roster of a range of experts in very different fields. And basically, they engage with the government. The way the office works is that I try to secure the political engagement with the government of these priority countries that I cover. And the government signs an agreement, which we call a joint communique, or sometimes a framework of cooperation with the United Nations, represented by the special representative of the Secretary General. And based on the needs of that government, an implementation plan is drawn up, and my team of experts walks in and they support the government. And basically the work that they do revolves around supporting the government in having a proper legislative framework in place to be able to address and prevent conflict-related sexual violence, working with the justice sector to strengthen the rule of law and ensure accountability for such violations, working with the security sector, such as working on code of conduct for the armed forces and the police, ensuring that there are clear command orders through chains of command with time-bound targets to bring perpetrators to justice, working around issues of access to justice for the survivors of sexual violence, looking at legal framework to ensure victim and witness protection. So there have been in all the priority countries on which I'm working, the team of experts has been providing this kind of technical support, ensuring that countries are better equipped to document cases of sexual violence, to investigate, to prosecute, ensuring that there is a transitional justice mechanism strategy in place, a reparations strategy in place. That's one implementing arm. And the second one is the work that I do through UN Action Against Sexual Violence, which is this entity comprising of 14 UN agencies, comprising, for example, of UN Women, UNICEF, IOM, UNFPA, OCHA, a range of UN entities, ensuring that we deliver as one. So they are very specific projects, very much targeted towards service provision for survivors that we do through those UN and different UN entities.
That is a very comprehensive overview. It shows how complex this is. It's not just a matter of establishing contact with the government and say, hey, I would like to help reduce sexual violence in this conflict, but it looks as though you've looked at it from A to Z, taken a very macro overview of it, looked at all the different elements, and then put together a plan, a strategy to go in and talk to the government and to implement that plan so that you can help bring a change in that particular country. It was very, very comprehensive. And you mentioned the UN agencies, the UN Population Fund, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, the OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Those are all key agencies of the UN system. Do you have a task force? Do you meet sort of an ad hoc situation? Are they all involved in virtually every area where you go in with a plan?
So each one of these 14 UN agencies, they have a focal point, and I have a UN action coordinator located in my office that does the coordination with the 14 UN entities. Just to give you a concrete example, we increasingly see the trend between sexual violence and trafficking, the nexus between trafficking, terrorism, and sexual violence happening in conflict. So then UN Action will actually be very proactive in engaging with the organization on migration, for example, to address this trafficking dimension. My office has brought the spotlight on one group that has remained very invisible, children born of rape. And we are working through UN Action, we are working very closely with UNICEF in having programs and support services for the children born of rape. And it's, for me, we are, after all, talking about a crime which has been one of history's most silenced crime. And I think for too long, it has been perceived as just one of those things that happens in times of conflict, that it's inevitable, it's an inevitable byproduct of war, and too bad. It's just one of those things that happens. And I think with Resolution 1888, we got this very, very important paradigm shift, because for the first time, sexual violence is seen as a security issue, as a threat to peace and security that requires both a security response as well as an operational response. And that is the turning point, Resolution 1888 adopted in 2009. So that now sexual violence is seen to be preventable, and it's a crime. It's one of the most serious violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law that really needs to be punished. And that's why I think that it's only through consistent and rigorous prosecution and conviction of perpetrators that we will be able to send a powerful signal to perpetrators and would-be perpetrators that this crime is no longer tolerated, that it can no longer be cost-free to rape a woman or a man, a boy or a girl.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of a media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website. You like our shows and you want to help distribute them and share them with your colleagues, friends, family, whatever it may be, please do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking about sexual violence in conflict zones, and my guest today is the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and that is Ms. Pramila Patten. She is an expert on this, and she's bringing us up to date on this very important topic. And I want to shift, while we got the camera in place, just flash the Secretary General's 2017 report on sexual violence. And we might just mention that, just to start off the second half, and mention a couple of the conclusions or recommendations or highlights of it. And perhaps we've already talked about a few of them up to this point.
Well, indeed, what we saw, that report was presented to the Security Council this year in April, but covered the period January to December 2017. And what that report, in terms of highlights of that report, we saw increasingly the trend, how with the rise or resurgence of conflict in various areas, together with the proliferation of arms, that these trigger sexual violence in many parts of the world. 2017 has also been marked by liberation of territories, and with that the release from captivity of many victims, as we saw in Iraq, but also in Nigeria, women released from Boko Haram. And we saw how victims of sexual violence come out deeply traumatized, how it's marked by it's a crime that is on which the society condemns more the victim than the perpetrator, and that the stigma is intense. Very often we see that the fear of rape is very soon followed by fear of rejection. I have been to Maiduguri, northeast Nigeria, where I met those young girls with their babies born of rape, who shared with me how they have been rejected not only by their families and the communities, but even by the internally displaced persons in the camp where they were living, and how they continued to be harassed and abused for having been associated with Boko Haram, and for having babies born from this terrorist organization. Similarly, I met with women who shared in Iraq, in Mosul, who shared with me the pain and agony of having had to abandon their children born of rape during the times that they had been sexual slaves. So this dimension of sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism is very much captured in the 2017 report. We also brought out how difficult it is becoming for women's human rights defenders to do their work, with human rights defenders being threatened of rape, with witnesses being intimidated, harassed for giving evidence in court. So these are very concerning trends for us. The trafficking nexus, sexual violence, conflict, and that's also a very disturbing trend. And we also see how sexual violence is being used to trigger displacement and to appropriate natural resources. For example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we've very unstable political environment. We've seen how in the fight for natural resources, for example, there have been unprecedented displacement of population, and again sexual violence is used to trigger that displacement. And increasingly sexual violence is preventing those displaced population from returning to their places of origin. Another trend that we have noticed through the reports that we have been receiving for that report was the targeting of, for example, LGBTI individuals. So there are some very, very disturbing trends. And in that report, which focus on 19 countries, I have recommended, and the Secretary General has actually listed 47 parties, mainly non-state armed groups, for who are persons and groups that are credibly suspected of having committed sexual violence or being involved in the commission of sexual violence, and that include no less than 7 terrorist groups, including ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. And what also emerges from the report is the importance of using judicial accountability, but also sanctions as a tool to prevent sexual violence. I think we are at a junction where we have to use all the diplomatic tools and all the tools that the Security Council has put at the disposal of this mandate.
Mm-hmm. That's very important. And of course, you do have a toolbox full of different approaches to come at this. When you were describing that situation with the women who were raped, and there is a tremendous stigma, unfortunately, and it goes back for many generations, perhaps bringing shame on a family or however it's perceived in that particular culture or subculture. But I was just curious, what do you do? How do you work with them? Do you help with educational programs? Do you work with the families to help them perceive the situation differently, to have a different mindset, if you will, or opinion of what happened? Do you work to try to help them get employment, or all of the above, and more, I'm sure? But how do you work with that particular individual?
Well, tackling stigma is a critical component of the work, and stigma manifests itself in very different ways. I mean, for example, stigma faced by men and boys victims of sexual violence manifests itself differently, and we need a set of responses to address male victims of sexual violence. We see in some parts of the world where stigma manifests itself and can have very lethal repercussions, such as honor killings, such as high rates of suicide or sexually transmitted diseases. But rejection by families and communities is we see this as being the most common one. So that's why I think I try to ensure that the response is comprehensive. It's not only first aid, medical and psychosocial support, but livelihood support. I'm putting a lot of focus on livelihood support. Having met with those victims, and they made a very strong case to show how their physical security is very much linked to their economic security, and having seen them, most of them having been rejected by their families and communities, that there will never be any healing if there is no economic empowerment. How do you build the resilience of these women if it's not through economic empowerment? So my office is placing a lot of focus on ensuring livelihood support. And I have just approved a project in South Sudan where for a one-stop shelter which has traditionally only provided medical, psychosocial and legal services, I'm including a component of skills building and livelihood support. But I also think that reparations is critical, because I have seen, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there has been an increase in the number of prosecutions and convictions, but in the absence of reparations for the victims, justice may not mean much. On the contrary, in the DRC, women have shared with me how, after having gone through that process of going to court and having a conviction, without reparations, they have come out and they are more ostracized by the communities who now know that they are victims of sexual violence, and it has become harder. So reparation is another important component that on which we are placing a lot of focus.
Well, Ms. Ms. Pramila Patten. This is a very important topic. It's a very, really a heart-rending topic, and hopefully the media will cover more of it, and you have so much good information to get out to the public, and we all have a role to play in helping to overcome this problem, especially with the media, to help us better understand this particular problem. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.